It was late October of 2013 when I decided to spend a few days hiking through a stretch of forest in northern Minnesota. I was 29 back then, living alone in Duluth, and I had this bad habit of disappearing into the woods whenever life felt too heavy. That week had been one of those times. My job was going nowhere. My truck needed repairs I couldn't afford, and I just wanted to be somewhere quiet. I packed light, a small tent, a sleeping bag, some cans of food, a flashlight, and my old Nikon camera. I parked my car at a ranger station, left a note about my route, and set off down a forgotten trail that wound deep into the thick pine woods. The first day went well. The weather was cool, cloudy, but dry. I hiked for about 6 hours before setting up camp near a small creek. The woods there were dense, mostly birch and pine, the kind that blocked out the sky when the wind stopped. I cooked a can of beans over my small stove and crawled into my sleeping bag early. It was silent that night, except for the occasional rustling of branches. I've camped enough to ignore noises like that, but sometime after midnight, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps crunching over dry leaves, slow and spaced apart, like someone walking carefully. At first, I thought it might have been a deer, but then it stopped, dead silent, right outside my tent. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed my flashlight, waited, then flicked it on. The sound stopped instantly. The light hit nothing but trees and the thin mist rolling off the creek. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, listening, until I convinced myself it was just an animal curious about the smell of food. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I noticed faint tracks near my tent. They weren't animal tracks. The ground was soft enough to leave a heel mark, human-sized. I didn't know what to make of it. Could have been an old print, but it looked fresh. I tried not to let it bother me and packed up to keep moving north. By midday, the trail had almost disappeared. The deeper I went, the older the forest felt. Huge trunks black with moss, fallen branches everywhere. The kind of silence that presses down on you. Around late afternoon, I came across something strange. An overgrown dirt path splitting off from the main trail. It wasn't on my map, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Still, curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The path twisted uphill for maybe half a mile before opening into a clearing. That's when I saw it. An old cabin sitting crooked in the trees, like it had been dropped there and left to rot. The roof sagged on one side, the porch steps were half gone, and the windows were either shattered or boarded up. There were rusted tools lying around, an axe head without a handle, a bucket, a bent shovel. Grass and weeds grew waist-high around it. I remember standing there for a while, staring at it, trying to guess how long it had been abandoned. Decades, probably. The logs were gray and cracked. The chimney had partially collapsed. I should have turned back, but something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was just the explorer in me, or maybe I was tired and looking for shelter. I pushed open the door. It creaked but didn't break. The air inside was stale and heavy, the kind of smell that sticks to your throat. Dust covered everything. There was a table on its side, an old metal bed frame against the wall, and a wood stove with a hole rusted through its side. I took a few photos, just out of habit, then set my pack down. The floorboards were soft, and I could see small holes where rodents had chewed through. On the far wall, I noticed something odd. There was a section of paneling that looked newer than the rest, nailed unevenly, like someone had covered something up. I remember feeling uneasy about it, but brushed it off. I figured maybe someone had patched a hole or covered a shelf. I stayed there maybe 20 minutes before deciding to leave. The place gave me a bad feeling, but right as I stepped outside, I saw something hanging from one of the trees about 20 feet away. It looked like a small wooden crate tied up by rope, swaying slightly. I walked closer and realized it was some kind of box, nailed shut, weathered from rain. There were no markings on it, just rough wood. I didn't touch it. I don't know why. Something about it just felt wrong, like I was crossing a line if I did. I turned around and went back down the path, trying not to look back. By the time I reached the creek again, it was getting dark. I set up my tent in a new spot, ate cold beans, and lay there thinking about that cabin. I couldn't get it out of my head. The hidden wall, the box hanging from the tree, the footprints near my tent the night before. That night, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, careful, coming from the same direction as before. I held my breath and turned off my flashlight this time. The steps got closer, maybe 10 feet away, then stopped. I waited for what felt like forever. Then I heard something else. A quiet metallic sound, like a nail being dragged over metal. I didn't move. Eventually, after what might have been an hour, the sound faded. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I packed my things fast. I decided I'd head back to my car and cut the trip short. I followed my trail south, but after an hour, I realized I wasn't seeing the same landmarks. The trees looked unfamiliar. The ground sloped differently. Somehow I had veered off the path. I tried retracing my steps, but it only led me deeper. Around noon, I saw the cabin again, the exact same one. I stood there frozen. I had walked in the opposite direction for hours, and yet here it was, right in front of me, like I'd gone in circles. I don't know how that was possible. I didn't want to go inside again, but I needed to get my bearings. Maybe from the roof I could spot the trail. When I went in, I noticed the panel on the wall had been pried open. I hadn't touched it the day before, but now the nails were on the floor, bent and rusted. Behind the panel was a small hollow space, and inside that, a rolled-up sleeping bag, torn and filthy, and an old jacket. They looked recent, not decades old. There was also a small metal pot and a plastic water bottle, half full. Someone had been using this place. Recently, I remember standing completely still, listening. The woods outside were dead quiet. Then I noticed something else. My own footprints weren't the only ones at the door. There were others, newer, deeper, going in and out. I backed out slowly, grabbed my pack, and started walking fast in the direction opposite the cabin. I didn't care if it was north or south. I just needed to get away. Every few minutes, I looked over my shoulder. I kept imagining someone following me, staying just out of sight. By late afternoon, I finally found a stretch of rocky ground I recognized near the creek. From there, I followed the water downstream until I reached the Ranger Road around dusk. My legs were trembling by the time I saw my car still parked in the lot. When I got back home that night, I uploaded the photos from my camera. Most were normal: trees, the creek, the cabin's exterior. But in one of the photos I took of the cabin doorway, something caught my eye. It was small, easy to miss, a reflection in the broken window. It wasn't my reflection. It looked like someone standing just inside the dark cabin, watching from the corner of the room. The next morning, I went back to the ranger station to tell them about the cabin and what I'd seen. The ranger on duty nodded slowly and said there were a few old hunting shacks up that way, most from the 1950s, but some had been taken over by squatters over the years. He said they usually avoided that area because of strange reports. I didn't ask what he meant. I never went back. I sold my camping gear a few months later and stopped hiking alone. Even now, when I look at those photos, I can still see that reflection, the outline of a person standing inside that rotten cabin, watching me. Maybe it was just someone living out there, hiding from the world. Maybe it was nothing but a trick of light. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still think about those footsteps in the dark, moving slow, careful, like someone who'd done it before. And I wonder if they're still out there, in that same cabin, waiting for whoever wanders off the trail next. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to rent a small cabin near the edge of the Peak District in the United Kingdom. I had been working in Manchester for too long, sitting behind a computer screen, losing touch with anything that felt real. I wanted silence, open air, and a bit of distance from people. The cabin I found online looked old but clean, sitting about a mile off a single-lane road that curved through the hills. The owner was some retired farmer who lived in town, and he handed me the key at a gas station with barely any instructions. Just told me to keep the door locked at night. I thought nothing of it then. The first few days were quiet. The cabin was small but solid stone walls, wood beams, a low roof, and one creaky window that looked out over a field that stretched all the way to a dark line of trees. I had brought enough supplies to last a week. Canned food, bottled water, a few books, and a small radio. There was no signal and my phone barely worked. I didn't mind. The silence was something I hadn't felt in years. During the day, I would walk down the hill and through the open field that led to the forest edge. The air always had a wet, earthy smell, and the sky never really cleared. It stayed a constant gray, the kind of gray that sits heavy in your chest. Every evening, I'd return to the cabin just before it got dark, light the small stove, and write in a notebook about whatever came to mind. On the fourth night, I woke up suddenly around 2 or 3 in the morning. I wasn't sure why. The only light came from the faint glow of the dying fire. I remember hearing something outside, just a small scraping noise. At first I thought it might be branches against the wall, but it wasn't windy. Then came a soft crunching sound, like footsteps moving slowly across the gravel path behind the cabin. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer this time. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a fox nosing around. After a minute, everything went quiet again. I lay there, frozen, listening until I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went out to check. The ground was damp from the night's drizzle, and I could see faint marks near the back door. They weren't animal prints. They were too long, too narrow, almost like the shape of bare feet, pressed lightly into the mud. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. Then I told myself they might just be distorted boot marks, or maybe some trick of the light. I tried to shake it off and went about my day, but something in the back of my mind stayed uneasy. That evening, the weather turned worse. The wind picked up, and by nightfall, rain started hammering against the roof. I sat by the fire again, trying to focus on reading, but every gust of wind made the old cabin creak and shift. I decided to call it an early night. Sometime later, I woke again. Not from a sound this time, but from a strange feeling. I can't describe it properly. It was just a sudden, sharp sense that I wasn't alone. I turned my head toward the window. The rain had slowed, and through the glass I could see something pale outside, something that caught the faint reflection of the firelight. I blinked hard, thinking it was my eyes playing tricks, but as they adjusted, I could make out the shape of a woman standing in the yard. She was facing the cabin, maybe 15 feet away, standing perfectly still. She wore a long gray coat that hung unevenly around her legs, and her hair looked thin and stringy, stuck flat to her head as if it were soaked. Even through the dim glass, I could tell something was off about how she stood. Too stiff, too still, her arms pressed close to her sides. I stayed frozen on the bed, barely breathing. After what felt like a full minute, she turned slightly, not walking, not rushing, just pivoting slowly toward the trees. Then she moved out of sight, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't move until morning. I barely slept, just lay there waiting for light to seep through the window. When I finally stepped outside, the grass was flattened where she had stood. There were footprints again, clearer this time, small, bare feet, leading from the field toward the trees. Nos chus. I followed them for a short distance until the ground became too wet to tell where they went. The air smelled heavy, damp, and metallic. My stomach turned as I stared into the forest. I thought about packing and leaving that day, but something kept me from it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe pride. I didn't want to admit that I was scared of some stranger wandering through the woods. I convinced myself she was just some local woman, maybe lost or unstable. Still, that night I locked both doors, shut the curtains tight, and kept the lantern burning until sunrise. The next day was cold and overcast. I walked into the woods during daylight, following the same direction the footprints had gone. The forest floor was covered with wet leaves that muffled every step. About 100 meters in, I found something strange. An old wooden crate lying broken beside a tree. Inside were scraps of fabric, maybe from old clothes, and a torn plastic bag filled with something dark and rotten. It smelled terrible. I didn't touch it. I stood there for a while, listening. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of water dripping from branches. I turned around and went back to the cabin. That night I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the image of that woman standing there. Every time the wind moved outside, I'd tense up. Around midnight, I went to the window again, even though I didn't want to. The field was empty at first glance, just faint fog rolling across the grass. But as I looked longer, I saw movement again, far out near the trees. It was that same shape, small, still watching. She wasn't moving closer, just standing there. I felt my throat tighten. I turned off the lantern, crouched down, and waited. After some time, I noticed the shape wasn't there anymore. I checked every few minutes until dawn, but she never came back into view. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, loaded everything into my small car, and walked once more around the cabin just to make sure I hadn't imagined all of it. At the edge of the field, I found something lying in the mud. A piece of gray fabric, torn, wet, and stiff from the cold. I didn't pick it up. When I got into the car and started down the narrow road, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, as the cabin shrank in the distance, I saw a figure near the doorway. It wasn't clear enough to make out any details, but I knew what I'd seen. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I drove faster, not stopping until I reached the main road. Later that week, back in Manchester, I did some digging online. I found an old local news article from 2009 about a woman who had gone missing near the same area. Said she'd been living rough after leaving an abusive situation. Last seen walking through those same hills. The search had ended without results. Locals mentioned seeing her wandering barefoot, disoriented, near the woods before she vanished. I don't know if what I saw was her or someone else, but it fits too closely to ignore. Maybe she had been living out there for years, surviving somehow, or maybe she died in those woods long before I arrived. I'll never really know, but that image of her, the soaked coat, the stillness, the way she turned toward the trees, stayed with me long after. I never went back to that cabin. The owner sent me a message a few months later asking if I'd left anything behind. I didn't answer. Sometimes at night, when it's quiet and raining, I still think about that field, that window, and the sound of those faint steps outside my door. And every time I close my eyes, I can still see that pale figure standing in the dark, watching, not saying a word, waiting for something I don't want to understand. It was late autumn of 2013 when I started working as a park ranger at Glacier Ridge National Park in Montana. I was 31 at the time, single, and looking for a quieter life after years of bouncing between jobs in the city. The cabin they gave me wasn't much, just a one-room wooden structure with a tin roof, a propane stove, a desk, and a cot. It stood about 7 miles from the nearest ranger station, surrounded by endless pine trees and uneven ground covered in brown needles. It was meant for overnight shifts when rangers had to monitor fire risk or wildlife activity deeper inside the park. My first few weeks were calm. The days passed quietly, The air smelled clean, and nights were still except for the wind moving through the trees. The cabin sat close to a narrow trail that only maintenance trucks used. A small radio on the desk connected me to the main outpost, and there was an old generator out back that I started every evening when the sun went down. Most nights I just sat there, filling out logs and listening to the sound of insects hitting the windows. But there was one stretch of forest about 2 miles north of the cabin that always made me uneasy. Locals had mentioned that area being strange, though not in any supernatural sense, just isolated. They said hikers sometimes got turned around out there because the terrain dipped and twisted in odd ways. It wasn't a part of the park that visitors went to often. My job didn't require me to patrol there much, so I avoided it when I could. One afternoon in mid-November, the weather changed fast. Clouds rolled in heavy and low, and rain started to fall hard against the roof. I remember that sound, the sharp tapping on the metal, echoing through the cabin. The generator buzzed softly outside. The wind picked up, pushing the trees back and forth, creaking like they were about to snap. I was supposed to check the north trail that evening because a team had reported a missing supply crate that fell off a truck earlier in the week. I waited a bit, hoping the storm would pass, but by 5:30, it was clear it wasn't going anywhere. I put on my rain gear, grabbed my flashlight and rifle, standard issue, and stepped out into the storm. The air was cold, and every breath came out white. The path was slick with mud, and the sound of rain hitting my jacket was all I could hear for the first half-mile. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the rain. After about 20 minutes, I reached the section where the truck had supposedly lost the crate. The tire tracks were still visible, filled with rainwater. I walked along them slowly, shining my light through the brush. That's when I saw something that stopped me. About 30 feet from the trail, near the base of a tree, there was a tarp dark green, partially covered in wet leaves. It wasn't the supply crate, but it looked like something that had been there a while. I moved closer, brushing aside branches until I reached it. It was a tent or what was left of one. The poles had collapsed, and the fabric was torn. Inside were pieces of gear, a rusted camp stove, a sleeping bag, and an old hiking boot half buried in mud. Everything was soaked and decaying. The tent looked like it had been there for months. There were no park markings, no tags, nothing to identify who it belonged to. I made a note of the location and turned back toward the trail, but I noticed something else a few feet away, a small pile of bones. They weren't large. Maybe a deer, I thought at first, but when I knelt down, the size and shape didn't look right. They were too small for a deer, too thin for a bear. I couldn't tell in the rain, but they looked disturbingly human. My stomach sank. I stood up fast, scanned the area again with my light, and decided to head back to the cabin immediately. The rain had soaked through my jacket, and the cold had started to sting my fingers. When I got back, I recorded the find in the log and radioed the main outpost, but the storm had knocked out most of the signal. Only static came through. I tried again and again, adjusting the antenna, but nothing worked. It was already dark now, and I wasn't about to hike back 7 miles through the woods in that weather. I decided to stay put until morning. The rain kept hammering the roof, steady and relentless. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound outside, not the wind this time. It was sharp and irregular, like twigs snapping one at a time. I turned off the radio and listened closely. It came from somewhere near the tree line behind the cabin. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe a branch falling, but it didn't stop. It went on for several minutes, slow, deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the brush. I turned off the light inside the cabin and stood near the window, peering out into the dark. The rain made it hard to see, but I caught faint movement near the edge of the clearing. Something tall shifted between the trees. It wasn't close enough to make out, but the shape looked upright. I stayed still, my pulse thudding in my ears. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, but nothing else happened. By morning, the rain had eased into a mist. I packed my bag, grabbed the map, and hiked back toward the main station. When I got there, I reported everything: the tent, the bones, the movement outside the cabin. The search team went out later that day. They found the tent exactly where I said it was, but the bones were gone. Every single one. The ground where I'd seen them was clean, like the rain had washed everything away, though it hadn't rained hard enough to do that. They spent 3 days combing through that section of the forest. They found more camping gear buried under debris, old cans, and clothes, but no remains. A few of the older rangers said the park had dealt with illegal campers before, people who disappeared during the off-season, but no official records matched the tent's condition or location. I started to think maybe I'd been mistaken about the bones. Maybe they'd been animal after all. But then something strange happened 2 nights later. I was back in the same cabin for another shift. The sky was clear, and the woods were silent. Around midnight, I decided to step outside for air. The moon was bright enough to light up the clearing, and that's when I noticed footprints near the edge of the cabin. Not boot prints, barefoot. The mud was still soft from the previous storm, and I could see the details clearly. They circled the cabin once, then trailed off toward the north woods. I followed them with my flashlight for about 10 yards before they disappeared into the grass. The pattern was odd, each step deep, like whoever made them had been carrying weight or limping. The hair on my neck stood up. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I knew the lock wouldn't do much against anyone determined. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the windows until sunrise. The next morning, I radioed the outpost and requested a transfer. I didn't give a reason at first, just said the isolation was getting to me. A week later, I was moved to a post closer to town. I haven't been back to that cabin since. A few months later, one of the rangers I used to work with told me something over coffee. They'd found another campsite near that same area, newer, abandoned just a week before discovery. Inside, they found a hunting knife, a backpack, and a notebook. Most of it was soaked and unreadable, but on one page they could still make out a few words written in shaky handwriting. It said, asterisk, kept hearing someone outside the tent at night. Asterisk, that was it. No name, no date. The gear was unregistered, and no missing persons report ever matched the items. They closed the file after a few months, chalking it up to transients or poachers. I've worked in other parks since then, and I still enjoy the quiet of the woods, but I never stay overnight alone anymore. Every time I hear branches breaking at night or see footprints that don't belong to me, my mind goes back to that cabin. The sound of rain on the roof, the footprints circling in the mud, and that empty spot in the forest where the bones had been. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened out there. All I know is that something or someone was moving through those woods long before I ever set foot there, and maybe it still is. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a few days off work and drive out to a small cabin I'd rented deep in the woods near Mackenzie Lake in northern Wisconsin. I wanted a quiet place to clear my head, just me and my dog, Cooper, a 6-year-old German Shepherd mix who never left my side. The cabin was supposed to be simple, just a place to stay while hiking and fishing. I remember the weather being unusually cold for early October, that kind of chill that makes the air feel heavier, sharper. I thought it would be peaceful. I didn't expect it to end the way it did. The drive there took longer than I planned. By the time I turned off the main road onto the narrow gravel path that led toward the lake, the sun was already sinking low, turning everything that strange golden orange color. The trees were close to full autumn, thick yellows and reds hanging over the road like a tunnel. Cooper was in the back seat, his head resting on the window edge, watching the trees go by. It was quiet except for the tires crunching over gravel and the faint sound of the engine. The cabin came into view after about 15 minutes. Small, dark brown wood, tin roof, one window facing the road, and a narrow porch that looked like it had been repaired multiple times over the years. There was a stone fire pit in front, with half-burned logs scattered around it, and behind the cabin the woods thickened fast. The lake wasn't visible from there, but you could smell it, that damp, earthy scent that comes off the water in cold weather. Inside, the cabin was just one big room with a small kitchen area to the left, a table, an old couch, and a bed against the far wall. There was a wood stove near the door, and the air inside had that stale, unoccupied smell, like dust and dry wood. I unpacked my stuff, fed Cooper, and started a small fire in the stove to get the place warm. By the time I sat down, the sky outside had gone completely dark. That first night was quiet, the kind of silence that you only get deep in the woods, where there's no traffic, no electricity hum, no far-off sounds. Just wind through the trees and the occasional crack of branches. Cooper slept on the floor beside the bed. I remember waking up around 3 a.m. because he growled low, steady, not loud but alert. His head was up, ears pointed toward the window. I couldn't see anything outside, just the reflection of the room in the dark glass. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. After a few minutes, he lay his head back down, though I noticed his eyes stayed open for a while. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I took him for a walk around the property. The air was cold, our breaths visible. The woods behind the cabin went on for miles, and the ground was soft from rain earlier in the week. There were old tire tracks in the mud near the edge of the trees, leading away toward the lake. They didn't look fresh, but they caught my attention because they went deeper into the woods where no proper road was marked on the map. I spent most of the day cutting some firewood and exploring around. The lake was about half a mile downhill. It was calm, dark water, surrounded by reeds and silent except for the occasional bird call. No one else seemed to be around. There were a few cabins further down the shore, but they looked empty for the season. That night, it rained. Steady and hard, beating against the metal roof loud enough to drown out everything else. The cabin was warm from the stove, and I was half asleep on the couch when Cooper started pacing. I could hear his nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. He wasn't growling this time, just restless. I sat up and saw him standing by the door, tail stiff, nose pointed at the gap under it. Then I heard it, faint but distinct, the sound of gravel crunching outside. Slow steps, like someone walking near the porch. Stopped for a while, then another few steps. My chest tightened. I turned off the small lamp, letting the firelight be the only glow in the room. Cooper's fur stood up along his back. He didn't bark, which worried me more than if he had. He just stood there, ears twitching. After a few minutes, the steps faded away. I waited, listening. The rain started to slow, and eventually, the only sounds were dripping water and the occasional wind gust. I didn't go back to sleep for a long time. In the morning, I found footprints on the porch. Not boot prints exactly, but maybe someone wearing heavy shoes. The rain had blurred the edges, but I could see where the mud had been tracked up the steps. I told myself it was probably a hiker or maybe someone from another cabin checking things out, though that didn't really make sense. The tracks stopped right at the door, then turned back. The day passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every time Cooper lifted his head or looked toward the window, I felt my stomach tighten. Around noon, I noticed something else. Near the edge of the woods, maybe 50 feet away, there was a dark-colored tarp lying flat on the ground. It hadn't been there the day before. I walked over cautiously, Cooper right beside me, tail low. The tarp was covering a pile of something, maybe wood or junk. When I pulled it back, there were two old, rusted metal barrels beneath it. Nothing strange about that, except the faint smell coming from them, like old fuel mixed with something sour. I covered them back up and walked away, trying not to think much about it. But by nightfall, my nerves were shot. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I kept the light low, and Cooper stayed near the door, lying down but alert. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard a distant thump. Not close, maybe from the woods behind the cabin. It was steady for a moment, then stopped. A few minutes later, there was another sound, this time closer. I couldn't tell what it was. Maybe someone dragging something over the ground. Cooper growled again, deep and constant. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the window, barely breathing. Then, a small metallic noise, like something tapping lightly against the door handle. I froze. Cooper lunged forward, barking hard this time, teeth bared, body tense. The noise stopped instantly. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept by the stove, my hands shaking. I waited, barely able to hear over the pounding in my chest. After what felt like forever, the forest went silent again. No rain, no wind, nothing. Just that complete stillness that makes your ears ring. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around dawn, I opened the door to look outside. The ground was damp from dew, and there were clear footprints again, this time circling the cabin. They were spaced unevenly, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one foot. I followed them a few yards, but they led back toward the woods and disappeared. That was enough for me. I packed up everything as fast as I could. The sun was barely up, mist hanging low over the trees. Cooper didn't leave my side for a second. As I loaded the truck, I looked one last time at the tree line behind the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow between the trees, but it could have been anything. I wasn't going to stay and find out. The drive back felt endless. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than normal. Cooper sat quietly the whole way, head up, ears twitching at every sound. When I finally hit the main road again, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in 2 days. Later that week, after I was home, I looked up the cabin online again, just to see if there were any reviews or comments. The listing was gone, completely removed. I tried searching for the owner's name, the property, anything, nothing came up. I checked satellite maps of the area out of curiosity. The shape of the clearing was still there, the road, even the outline of the lake. But where the cabin had been, there was nothing, just trees. I never went back. Even now, years later, every time I hear rain hit a metal roof, I think about that night. The steps, the tapping, those footprints circling the porch. Whatever was out there wasn't some ghost or monster. It was someone real, someone who knew I was alone, miles from anyone else. And that's what makes it worse, because people, they're the ones you really have to be afraid of. It was late October, 1998, when I drove out to the edge of a small town in northern Maine to spend a weekend alone. I had just turned 30, and for months I'd been wanting some quiet. No city noise, no people, no phones ringing. A coworker told me about an old cabin that used to belong to his uncle, sitting near an abandoned graveyard out in the woods. It wasn't some tourist rental or hunting lodge, just a leftover building from the 1950s, empty for years. I didn't think much about the graveyard part. I just wanted a few days of silence. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The main road turned into a narrow dirt path lined with leafless trees. The woods on both sides looked endless, gray and silent, with dead leaves stuck to the wet ground. The air smelled of damp soil and pine. I remember the way the sky looked that evening, dim, heavy, like it was about to rain. My car tires crunched through small rocks, and every few minutes, the trees seemed to close in tighter around the road. After almost 2 hours of slow driving, I finally saw it. The cabin. It sat at the edge of a clearing, maybe 50 yards from a rusted metal fence that surrounded what looked like the old graveyard my coworker had mentioned. The cabin was smaller than I thought. Made of weathered logs, half of the roof sagging on one side. There was a small stone chimney, a broken porch railing, and a single dirty window. No other buildings for miles. I parked the car next to a patch of tall weeds and stepped out. The ground was soft and uneven, and the cold air hit me right away. The smell of the forest was strong. Wet leaves, rotting wood, and a faint chemical smell like old paint. When I opened the cabin door, it made a long creaking sound that echoed in the silence. Inside, it was worse than I expected. Dust covered everything, and the air was stale, like no one had opened that place in decades. There was one small table, a wooden chair, a cot in the corner, and an old kerosene lamp sitting on a shelf. I spent the first few hours cleaning. I cleared away dead insects from the windowsills, brushed off the table, and swept the floor with a broken broom I found behind the door. I kept the front door open to air it out, and cold wind blew in, carrying that sharp forest smell. The quietness was strange. It wasn't peaceful, just heavy. Even the birds didn't seem to make any noise. After sunset, I built a small fire in the old iron stove. The wood hissed and smoked before catching. The orange light filled the cabin, flickering over the walls. I heated a can of soup and sat by the small window, looking out. I could just barely see the outline of the graveyard in the distance. Crooked stones sticking out of the ground, some leaning sideways, others buried under weeds. The fence was half collapsed, rusted in several places. As the night got colder, I started hearing small sounds outside. Not footsteps, not anything clear, just faint rustling, like dry leaves being pushed around. I told myself it was probably raccoons or wind shifting through the trees. Still, it made it hard to relax. Around midnight, I finally blew out the lamp and lay down on the cot. The silence was thick enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was pitch dark. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I had heard something or just dreamed it. Then there it was again, a sharp sound outside. Not wind this time. It was metal scraping against something solid, coming from the direction of the graveyard. I sat still, listening. It happened again. Slow, uneven, like someone dragging a shovel across rock. My chest tightened. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer brushing past the fence. But it didn't sound like that. It went on for several minutes, then stopped completely. I waited, staring at the window, but saw nothing. Finally, after almost an hour of silence, I fell back asleep. The next morning was gray and misty. The grass outside was wet, and the woods looked darker. I made coffee on a small gas burner I'd brought with me and decided to walk toward the graveyard. The closer I got, the more the air smelled of wet earth and metal. The fence around the graveyard was bent in several spots, and one of the gates hung open. Inside, the graves were old. Most of the headstones had faded writing or none at all. Some graves were just mounds of dirt with bits of stone marking them. Then I saw something strange near the far corner. One of the newer-looking graves, maybe from the 1970s, had fresh soil piled unevenly over it. The ground looked like it had been disturbed recently. I crouched down, touched the dirt. It was still damp but soft, as if someone had dug there recently. I looked around. No footprints, no tools, no sign of anyone else. I went back to the cabin and tried to forget about it. I told myself maybe some animal had been digging, or rain had washed the dirt down. But the thought stayed in my head all day. Every time I glanced out the window, I found myself looking toward the graveyard. The fog never really lifted, and by evening, everything looked darker than it should have. That night, I stayed awake longer. I kept the fire going and sat near the window. Around midnight again, I heard that same metal scraping sound. This time it was closer, clearer. It came from the direction of the open gate. My hands started shaking, and I turned off the lamp, trying to listen. The scraping stopped, replaced by a dull, thudding sound. Then silence. After a long minute, I stepped outside. The cold hit me hard. I could see my breath. The forest was dead quiet, no wind, no animals. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, staring toward the graveyard, but couldn't see a thing. When I turned back toward the cabin, I froze. There were footprints in the mud near the porch, fresh ones too. Heavy, deep prints that didn't belong to me. They came from the direction of the graveyard, stopped near the door, then turned back the way they came. I felt sick. My heart was pounding, and I didn't want to move. I went back inside and locked the door, even though the lock barely worked. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there waiting for daylight. In the morning, I walked out again. The footprints were still there, half filled with rainwater. I followed them for a few feet, but they disappeared into the grass near the fence. I didn't know what to think anymore. It didn't feel like a prank. No one even knew I was out there except for my coworker. I packed up that afternoon. I didn't care about finishing the weekend anymore. I just wanted to leave. I cleaned up, threw my things in the car, and started the drive back. As I passed the graveyard one last time, I noticed something. There was a new patch of dirt near the open gate, smaller than a grave but freshly dug, as if someone had buried or unburied something overnight. I didn't stop to look. The drive back to town felt endless. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't stop anywhere. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for 10 minutes before going inside. My hands were still shaking. For days after that, I couldn't sleep right. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that soft dirt, those footprints, that scraping sound. A week later, I called my coworker to ask if he knew anything else about that cabin. He said his uncle used to dig graves for a small private cemetery back in the 1970s. But when the town expanded, the land was abandoned. The uncle died years ago, and no one ever went back. That was the last time I went anywhere near that part of Maine. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about that disturbed grave, the footprints, and the sound of metal against stone in the middle of the night. I'll never know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. Someone had been digging in that graveyard long after it was supposed to be forgotten. And for some reason, they came all the way up to the door of that cabin. It had been almost 4 years since I last saw my ex-husband's cabin. The divorce had ended bitterly, and I swore I'd never go back to that part of the state again. But that place had a certain pull, something about the silence of the woods and the way the light used to fall through the tall pine trees at dusk. It was late October, around 2018, when I finally decided to take a long drive out toward northern Montana. I told myself it was just curiosity. Maybe a way to close a chapter that had been sitting open for too long. The drive was long and quiet. The old highway wound through thick stretches of forest, most of it untouched and wild. I hadn't been out that way since before we split. Back then, we'd built the cabin together, well, mostly him. He'd been the kind of man who liked doing things with his hands, working in silence, cutting his own wood, fixing things that didn't need fixing. The cabin sat on a half-acre of land near a small lake, deep in the timberline where you'd lose cell signal 5 miles before reaching it. The closer I got, the more familiar everything started to look. The curves in the dirt road, the cluster of birch trees on the left, even the old rusted mailbox that had both our initials scratched into the side. I almost turned around right there, but I didn't. I don't even know why I kept driving. Maybe I just needed to see that it was still standing, that it hadn't vanished with the life we built together. When I pulled up, the place looked smaller than I remembered. The roof was sagging a little, and the paint had peeled off most of the wood. The porch steps were broken on one side, and the door hung crooked. It looked abandoned, forgotten, just like everything that happened there. The air was colder than I expected, with that damp smell that comes right before rain. I parked the car and just sat there for a while, watching the cabin through the windshield. Eventually, I got out. The wind pushed through the trees in low waves, and all I could hear were leaves scraping against each other and the faint creak of the porch railing shifting in the breeze. I stepped onto the porch slowly, careful where I put my feet, because the boards looked weak. The front door wasn't locked. I pressed on the handle, and it opened with a dry groan that echoed through the empty space inside. The smell hit me first. It was a mix of dust, old wood, and something slightly rotten, like wet fabric left too long in the dark. The air inside was heavy and stale. My shoes left faint prints in the layer of dirt on the floor. The furniture was still there, the small couch we bought secondhand, the table that still had the burn mark from the time he dropped a cigarette. Everything was exactly as it had been, only older, darker, forgotten. I walked around slowly, my hand brushing across the dusty walls. The small framed pictures were still hanging, crooked, their glass fogged with age. There was one of us fishing near the lake, one from a camping trip in 2014, and another of him holding a deer he'd hunted. I didn't like looking at that one, so I turned it face down. In the corner near the wood stove, I noticed a few things that hadn't been there before. An old sleeping bag, a dirty backpack, and a pair of boots. It looked like someone had been staying there, or maybe passing through. The boots were big, worn at the toes. There was a coffee can on the counter with a spoon sticking out, and next to it, a few empty cans of beans. The realization made my stomach tighten. I wasn't alone, or at least someone had been here recently. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I already knew there'd be no signal. The screen showed 0 bars. I thought about leaving right then, but something made me linger. I don't know if it was stubbornness or just plain foolishness, but I went into the small bedroom anyway. The bed frame was the same one he built himself, thick pine beams nailed together unevenly. The mattress was covered with an old blanket, and the smell of mildew was stronger in there. The window on the far side was cracked open slightly, letting in the faint smell of rain and pine. On the floor, I noticed muddy footprints leading from the doorway to the corner near the window. They were fresh, darker than the rest of the dust-covered floor. My chest went tight when I saw them. Whoever had been here, they were here recently, maybe even that morning. I didn't hear anyone. The woods outside were quiet, except for the wind. But the kind of silence that hangs after realizing you're not alone feels heavier, like the air itself thickens. I walked back toward the living room, scanning the corners, checking behind the wood stove, then stepping back toward the front door. The door was still open, swinging slightly with the breeze. Then I heard something faint, a low, distant sound from outside. It wasn't a voice, not an animal either. More like a faint clatter, metal against wood. I looked through the dirty window and saw movement by the edge of the trees, near the back of the property. Someone or something had dragged something across the ground. It was too far to make out clearly, but the sound was enough to freeze me in place. I turned off my phone screen and stood still by the door. I waited for a few minutes, just listening. Nothing moved after that. The woods went back to being quiet. The only thing breaking the silence was the soft drip of water from the roof as the rain started to fall. Came down steady, turning the dirt outside into thick mud. I decided it was time to go. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line again. Nothing. The sound had stopped. The air was cold and sharp now, rain soaking through my jacket almost instantly. I walked back to my car, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. But when I got to the driver's side door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The hood of my car was wet, but not from rain. There were handprints smeared across the front, dark and greasy, like someone had touched it recently. The prints were large, too large to be mine. I could see the streaks of dirt down the side mirror, like someone had leaned close to look inside. I felt that same stillness again, that sense that someone was nearby, watching. I scanned the woods again, but the rain made everything blurry. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, and the sound of the rain hitting the roof of the cabin made it hard to tell where anything was coming from. I didn't waste another second. I got in the car, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, lighting up the cabin one last time. For a second, I thought I saw something near the porch. A shape, maybe a man standing there, but I wasn't sure. The rain distorted everything. I drove fast down the dirt road, the tires slipping slightly in the mud. I didn't look back again, not once. The road seemed longer than I remembered, twisting endlessly before I finally reached the paved highway. Only when I saw the first set of power lines did I start to breathe normally again. I never told anyone what I saw or what I thought I saw. It wasn't something I could explain easily without sounding paranoid. Maybe it was a drifter using the old cabin for shelter. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. But those handprints, they stuck in my mind. They weren't from hours ago. They were fresh. Someone had been there, close enough to touch my car while I was inside that cabin. A few weeks later, I checked the property records out of curiosity. The land had been sold 2 years earlier to some out-of-state company. The cabin was marked for demolition. I guess they never got around to it. Sometimes I wonder if someone's still living out there, off the grid, hidden in the woods, using what's left of what we built. I haven't gone back since. But every time I drive past a stretch of pine forest in the rain, I remember that cabin. The smell of wet wood, the prints on the hood, the silent shape near the porch. And I realize some places aren't haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by the people who never left. It was the summer of 2008 when I decided to take a job at an old farm in southern Nebraska. I was 26 then, broke, tired of city noise, and needed some time away from everything. A friend of a friend had told me about a man who needed someone to look after his farm while he stayed with family out of state. It sounded simple: feed the animals, keep the place tidy, and stay in the cabin near the edge of the property. It wasn't much money, but it included food and a place to sleep, so I took it. The farm sat about 4 miles off the main road, surrounded by endless cornfields and rough dirt tracks that seemed to stretch forever. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, just a handful of stores and a diner. The first time I drove out there, my car threw dust into the air so thick it looked like fog. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed right away how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet. No birds, no wind, not even insects at first. Just stillness. The cabin itself was small but solid, built from dark, weathered wood. The paint on the window frames was peeling, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. Inside, there was a faint smell of old hay mixed with something metallic, almost like rust. The furniture was basic: a small bed, a table, and a wood stove that looked older than I was. I remember thinking it wasn't bad, just lonely. My first few days went by smoothly. I got used to feeding the chickens early, checking the fences, and walking through the fields in the evenings. The farm had this wide open feeling that made you think about how far away you were from anyone else. At night, it got darker than I'd ever seen before. No streetlights, no house lights in the distance, just an ocean of blackness. On the fourth night, I started noticing strange things. Around midnight, I woke up because I heard the animals making noise outside. The chickens were clucking loud, almost in panic, and the old dog that came with the property was barking toward the field. When I stepped out with my flashlight, I saw the tall corn stalks moving like something heavy was pushing through them. But when I pointed the light that way, it stopped. The dog stood there stiff, staring at the field, his hair up. I stayed out there for a while but didn't see anything, so I went back in. The next morning, I found one of the chicken coop doors slightly open. I knew I'd locked it the night before. One chicken was missing. I blamed coyotes or maybe raccoons. Still, I checked the latch twice that evening before bed. That night, I woke again to the same noises, only louder. The dog was growling low, pacing near the window. I heard something scrape against the outside wall. Slow, steady, like someone dragging a stick. I froze on my bed, listening. The scrape went around the corner, then stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes before I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and looked out through the small window. The beam showed nothing but the tall corn swaying slightly. The next morning, I walked the property, checking for tracks. Near the edge of the cornfield, I found something odd. There were boot prints in the dirt, large ones, but they led nowhere. Just a few steps into the corn, then gone. No path, no drag marks, nothing. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone out here since I arrived. Over the next few days, I started feeling like I was being watched. Every time I went to the barn or walked to the water pump, I had this crawling feeling between my shoulders, like someone was standing just behind me. I kept turning around but never saw anyone. The animals were restless too. The cows kept grouping together near the fence, facing the same direction every evening, toward the tree line behind the fields. The fifth night was the worst. I remember the air being thick and humid, and the sky had no stars, just a heavy gray cover. Around 11 p.m., I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. It wasn't an animal. It was a low, rough breathing, coming from just outside my window. I didn't move. I just sat there on my bed, staring at the window. The breathing went on for maybe 20 seconds, then a soft thump, like someone placing their hand on the wall. I couldn't see a thing through the glass, but I could feel it. Someone was out there. When I finally got the courage to look outside, I saw movement near the barn. A shape, dark and tall, moving slowly around the corner. My flashlight caught just a glimpse. A man, or at least what looked like one, wearing old dirty clothes, head slightly tilted down, walking in this slow, stiff way. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. I ran back, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time the wind blew, I thought it was him. Every creak in the woods sounded like footsteps. When the sun came up, I checked outside. There were more footprints now circling the cabin. Some led to the window where I'd heard the breathing. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while. I found the prints going toward the barn, but then they stopped again, just like before. I called the farm owner later that day using the old landline in the cabin. He didn't seem too surprised when I told him someone had been lurking around. He said it was probably just some drifter and told me to keep the shotgun loaded, but that didn't comfort me much. That night, I barely moved. I sat at the table with the shotgun beside me and a candle burning low. Around 2 a.m., I heard a metallic sound near the barn, like a latch being undone. I stayed inside, listening hard. Then came another sound, slow footsteps on gravel. They got closer to the cabin. I turned the light off and waited. The steps stopped right outside the porch. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt before. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Someone was on the porch. I held my breath. The handle of the door moved slightly. Once, twice, then stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. Finally, nothing. When daylight came, I opened the door carefully. The dirt outside had fresh prints again. Barefoot this time, bigger than mine. Whoever it was had come all the way up, touched the handle, and then turned back. That morning, I packed my things. I didn't care about finishing the job or the money. I loaded the car and drove off down the dirt road without even looking back at the cabin. Later, when I told the local sheriff about it, he nodded slowly and said there'd been reports of a man wandering the fields in that area for years. No one knew where he came from. Some thought he was just a homeless drifter living off old barns and abandoned sheds. Others said he was a former farmhand who'd gone off the rails after losing everything. No one ever caught him. A week later, I got a call from the farm owner. He told me the chickens were gone, all of them, and one of the barn doors was ripped clean off its hinges. He said it looked like someone had been living out there in the hayloft. Old clothes, half-eaten food, even a makeshift bed. He asked me if I'd noticed anything before I left. I didn't know what to say. It's been years since then, but I still remember those nights like they just happened. The sound of that slow breathing outside the window, the footprints in the dirt, the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometimes when I drive through the countryside, I see old barns or fields that look just like that place, and it all comes back. I never went back to the farm. I never wanted to, but I still think about that man, the one who walked around the cabin, who stood outside my window. He wasn't a ghost or some monster. He was real, and that's what makes it worse. Because somewhere out there, in the quiet corners of the countryside, someone like him could still be watching another cabin right now, waiting for the next person who thinks they'll just stay a few nights alone. It was early September of 2013 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin near Wren Lake in northern Minnesota. I was 29 at the time, working as a surveyor, and I'd been going through a rough stretch. Too much noise, too many people, too much of everything. A friend of mine, who owned a few acres by the lake, offered his small hunting cabin for me to stay in. He hadn't used it in over a year, said it needed some cleaning, but it was dry and quiet. That was all I wanted, quiet. The drive up there took nearly 6 hours. The last 40 minutes were on a dirt road that twisted between dense pine trees, thick and old, their shadows overlapping the road even though it was midday. The air was cool but heavy with the smell of wet soil and moss. When I finally saw the cabin, it wasn't much. A small, single-story structure with a slanted tin roof, a faded red door, and a little porch that sagged on one side. It was set about 100 yards from the lake, which I could just see through the trees, a silver reflection cutting through the green. Inside, it was plain. One small bedroom with a narrow bed, a table and chair by the window, a wood stove, and a small kitchenette with a rusty sink and a propane burner. The air was stale and smelled faintly of dust and mouse droppings. I opened the windows to air it out and spent the first few hours cleaning, sweeping the floors, wiping down the counters, making sure no animal had nested inside. By evening, it felt decent. I made some instant noodles, sat on the porch, and listened to the wind move through the trees. The lake was still, with only the occasional ripple breaking the surface. For a while, it was peaceful, exactly what I needed. That night, I went to bed early. The cabin had no electricity, just an oil lantern that I kept near the bed. I remember lying there, listening to the woods. It wasn't silent, it never is in the wild. There were insects, frogs near the lake, the occasional rustle of branches when the wind picked up. I must have fallen asleep around 10. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was completely dark except for a thin blue light from the moon leaking through the window. What woke me was a sound, a steady tapping, faint but rhythmic. It was coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it might be a branch knocking against the side of the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but the sound didn't stop. It was slow, irregular, tap, tap, pause, tap. I got up, put on my boots, and stepped outside with the lantern. The air was cold and damp. I looked around but didn't see anything moving. The trees were still, the lake was silent. I walked along the side of the cabin and realized the sound was coming from the far corner near the woodshed. I moved closer, and that's when I saw a loose piece of tin siding on the shed flapping slightly in the breeze. It hit the wall each time the wind shifted. That was it. Just that. I felt a bit stupid for getting up over something so simple. I secured the tin with a rock and went back to bed. The next day went smoothly. I fished for a while, made some notes for work I'd brought along, and chopped a bit of firewood. I didn't see another person the whole day. By late afternoon, fog started to roll in from the lake. It made the air colder, and by dusk, visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. It was eerie, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your ears. I built a small fire outside, just for warmth, and stayed close to it until it burned down. That night, it happened again. I woke up around 2 a.m. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was something heavier, like dull thuds, as if someone was walking slowly outside on the porch. I held my breath and listened. 3 steps, then nothing. Another step after a few seconds. I stayed still for maybe a full minute, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it. I reached for the lantern, but I didn't light it yet. I didn't want to draw attention if someone was really out there. The steps moved again, slower now, toward the door. Then silence. I finally lit the lantern, just a faint glow, and went to the window beside the bed. I couldn't see much, just the porch railing and fog. I waited there, staring into the gray blur, until my arms started to ache from holding the lantern. Then something moved, quick, just a shape, like someone passing by the window. I froze. I stared for maybe a full minute, but nothing moved again. I didn't go outside this time. I sat in the chair with my back to the wall and stayed awake until dawn. When the sun came up, I stepped outside to look around. The porch boards were damp with dew. There were footprints, faint but clear enough to see. They were human, bare feet, adult-sized. The ground around the porch was soft enough to show where the person had come from, the edge of the tree line near the woodshed. I followed the trail a few steps, but it faded quickly on the dry ground. It didn't make sense why someone would be out there, barefoot in that cold. The next 2 days, I kept busy just to stay distracted. I told myself it was probably some drunk camper who got lost. I kept the hatchet by the bed at night, though I didn't sleep much. Each night, I'd hear small things. Cracking branches, faint movement near the trees, sometimes even a whisper of breathing that I couldn't tell was real or in my head. I was on edge constantly. On the 5th night, it escalated. I had turned in early and was just starting to drift off when I heard the soft creak of the porch steps again. This time, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, every muscle tense. The sound came closer, slow and deliberate. Then there was a long pause. After that, I heard the faintest sound, something brushing against the door. The handle moved, not forcefully, but like someone testing it, quietly. The door was locked, but my breath caught anyway. I stayed like that for maybe half an hour, afraid to even breathe too loud. Eventually, the sounds faded away. I didn't sleep that night. When daylight came, I packed my things. I had planned to stay a full week, but I couldn't take another night there. Before leaving, I checked the porch again. More footprints, the same size, same shape. Only this time, they were clearer, and I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The prints came from the lake, not toward it, from it, straight from the water up the bank across the clearing to my cabin. I drove out that morning, back down the dirt road, not stopping once. I didn't even look back at the cabin when it disappeared behind the trees. When I got to the main road, I pulled over and sat there for a long while, trying to understand what I had seen. There were no signs of anyone else in the area. No other cars, no camps, nothing. A few weeks later, I told my friend about it when he called to ask how the cabin was. He said the property was fine when he'd last checked. I didn't mention the footprints from the lake. I didn't tell him that when I'd gone to the water's edge before leaving, I saw a single, faint set of wet footprints leading back into the lake. as if whoever it was had walked straight into it and never come out. I don't know what it was, a person, a wanderer, maybe someone living off the grid out there. All I know is that those prints were real. I remember the size of them, the depth in the soft mud, the way the water still shimmered in them like they'd been made minutes before. I've been to a lot of remote places since then for work, spent weeks in woods and mountains alone, but I've never gone back to Wren Lake. Sometimes on cold nights when I can't sleep, I still think about the sound of those steps on the porch, slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was already knew I was awake and listening. And that thought stays with me every time I hear something move outside my window at night, because I'll never be sure if it was just a lost person out there, or someone who knew exactly where I was, waiting for me to open that door. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a small cabin outside Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd been working construction jobs for most of the year and needed a break from everything. The noise, the city, people. The cabin belonged to an older guy I knew from work, a quiet man who said he hadn't used it in years. It sat on a stretch of dry land surrounded by pine and scrub, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. He told me there was no running water and that the generator sometimes cut out, but I didn't care. I wanted isolation. I brought my old pickup, a few boxes of canned food, a small cooler, and my dog, Rex. Rex was a German Shepherd mix I'd had for 6 years. Loyal, calm, and protective. He was the only company I needed. The drive up the dirt path to the cabin was long and rough, the kind of road where you start wondering if you took the wrong turn. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low, the light spilling through the trees in orange streaks. The cabin itself looked like it had been built sometime in the 70s. The wood was weathered, the porch tilted slightly, and a few shingles hung loose from the roof. There was an old metal water tank next to it and a rusted oil drum near the back. Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and dust. The furniture was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a single bed, and a wood stove that looked like it had been used more than anything else. The first few days were peaceful. I spent the mornings cutting small pieces of dead wood from the forest edge, the afternoons reading or walking with Rex along the trails behind the cabin. The nights were colder than I expected. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and sometimes I could hear branches scraping against the roof. The kind of sounds that are normal when you're far from civilization, but when you're alone, they make you listen a little too long. It was around the 5th night that things started to feel off. Rex had always been calm, rarely barking unless someone came too close to the yard. But that night, he was restless. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of him growling low near the window. I got up, thinking maybe it was a coyote or a raccoon. I looked outside, but there was only darkness. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Usually, I'd hear the distant sound of insects or wind, but it felt like everything had stopped moving. Rex stayed tense for a while, his eyes fixed on the tree line. I finally pulled him back to the bed, thinking he was just on edge. But even after I lay down, I couldn't fall asleep easily. There was something about the silence outside that didn't feel right. The next morning, I found tracks near the side of the cabin. At first, I thought they were human, bare footprints pressed into the dirt, but they looked strange. The toes seemed longer than normal, and the heel print was shallow, like whoever left them had walked lightly. I told myself it was just erosion, maybe my eyes playing tricks. But there was something about those prints that stuck in my head all day. Later that evening, while chopping wood near the back, I noticed something across the clearing. Between 2 trees, I thought I saw a person standing, tall, thin, not moving. I froze for a second, thinking maybe it was a hunter. But then it shifted slightly, and I could tell it wasn't wearing normal clothes. It looked like animal skin, or maybe it was just the way the light hit. I stared for a long time, and when I finally blinked, it was gone. I told myself I was just tired. I'd been out there for days with barely any real sleep. I fed Rex, checked the generator, and tried to shake the feeling off. But that night, Rex wouldn't go near the windows. He kept pacing around the door, sniffing and growling under his breath. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, this time to a sound that made my stomach drop. It was the sound of footsteps outside, slow, dragging steps moving around the porch. I sat up, listening, holding my breath. The wood creaked softly once, then again. Rex stood near the door, growling deep and low, his body rigid. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the window. I didn't see anything at first, just the beam cutting through the dark, catching flakes of dust. Then, for a split second, I saw something move, something pale slipping behind the edge of the porch post. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light came, I stepped outside with Rex beside me. The air was cold, and the ground was damp. Near the porch steps, I saw the prints again. Bare feet, long toes like before, only this time they were fresher. They led from the tree line straight to the porch and back again. Whoever or whatever it was had come right up to the cabin. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe someone was wandering out here, a squatter or a hunter playing tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I moved a chair against the door that night and kept the flashlight beside me. The following night was worse. It was colder, and the wind blew harder. The generator cut out around 11, leaving me in silence except for the wind. I stayed in bed with Rex lying near the door. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to a faint scraping sound, like nails against wood. I turned my head slowly toward the window. In the dim moonlight, I saw a shape standing just outside. It was tall and thin, and its skin looked stretched, almost gray. It was pressed against the glass, one hand flat against it. I didn't move. I could see the outline of its face, not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes looked wrong, like it was wearing something that didn't fit. I blinked, and it was gone. Rex barked once, sharp and angry, then went silent, staring at the same spot. I sat there, heart pounding, until the first light came through the trees. That morning, I found more prints around the cabin, circling it over and over. I packed everything. I didn't care how far I had to drive. I just wanted to leave. I loaded Rex into the truck and started down the dirt path. My hands were shaking the whole time. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see something following. When I finally reached the paved road, I stopped and got out to check the back of the truck. My boxes were there, the cooler was there, but the lid on one of the food crates was open. Inside, one of the cans had been bitten, not opened, bitten. Deep teeth marks in the metal, like something had tested it. I drove straight to town and didn't look back. I stayed at a cheap motel that night. When I showered, I noticed scratches along my forearm. Not deep, but fresh. I still don't know how I got them. A week later, I went back to work and told myself I'd imagined half of it. Maybe it was a trespasser, someone living out there, someone unstable. But even now, sometimes when the night is still and the wind picks up, I think about those footprints and that gray skin pressed against the glass. I never went back to that cabin. A year later, I heard from the guy who owned it that he'd sold the land to someone else. He said the new owner found strange things near the property. Old bones, animal skins hung in trees, pieces of clothing scattered through the woods. I didn't tell him what I saw. Some things it's better to leave unspoken. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't just someone wandering the woods. It was something that looked human but wasn't. Something that watched me, learned how I moved, and came right up to the window to see if it could wear my face next. I've lived in cities ever since, where the noise never stops and the dark doesn't reach the windows. And every time I hear about strange things in the desert or the mountains, missing hikers, tracks that don't match, I remember that night and how close it came to stepping inside. It was early November of 2016 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small hunting cabin deep in the forests of northern Minnesota. I was 34 then, working long weeks at a construction company, and I'd been craving silence. Just some days without engines, phones, or city noise. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old coworker who rarely used it. He told me it was rough but solid, stocked with enough wood, canned food, and water to last a while. I drove up on a Friday morning, leaving Duluth before sunrise. The farther I got, the quieter it became. Trees crowding the road, frost glazing the ditches, fog hanging low over frozen ponds. The dirt road that led to the cabin was barely visible, just two ruts carved between tall pines. My truck bounced over roots and frozen mud until the trees finally opened up to a small clearing. The cabin sat crooked at the edge of the clearing, built from old logs that had turned gray over the years. The roof sagged in the middle, and the porch steps creaked when I walked up them. Still, it felt solid in that old, lonely kind of way. There was a wood stove inside, a small table, a cot, and some shelves filled with dusty jars. It smelled like damp wood and ash. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. I stacked my rifle in the corner, checked the lantern, and got the fire going. The air was cold enough to see my breath. It took a while before the stove started pushing out warmth, but once it did, the place felt livable. I made coffee on a small camp stove and stepped outside to breathe in the quiet. The forest around me was so still it almost felt wrong. No wind, no movement, just trees, thick and endless, stretching out in every direction. The first day was peaceful. I hiked a few miles north of the cabin with my rifle, marking trees along the way to find my way back. I didn't see much, just a few deer tracks and the distant sound of running water. When the sun started dropping, I turned around. By the time I reached the cabin, the air had turned heavy with cold again. The stove took nearly an hour to bring the temperature up enough to take off my jacket. I ate a can of stew, washed the dish in melted snow, and sat by the fire until my eyes felt heavy. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a crunch of snow. Slow, steady, deliberate. I lay still on the cot, staring into the dark, waiting to hear it again. After a few seconds, another crunch came, closer this time, just beyond the wall. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something bigger. I reached for my rifle, keeping my hands steady, but the sound stopped completely. I waited for what felt like a long time, listening, but there was nothing more. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing serious and drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside to check. The ground around the cabin was still crusted with frost, but I could see prints near the porch, boot prints, not animal tracks. They were old, maybe a few days, pressed deep into the frozen soil. I figured maybe they were mine from when I first arrived, though they looked bigger than my boots. I brushed it off and went about my day, but something about them stayed in the back of my mind. The second day went quietly. I walked farther south, following a faint trail that led down to a narrow creek. The water was half frozen, the air sharp enough to sting my nose. I saw some rabbit tracks and a single elk track near the water, but nothing worth shooting. I spent the afternoon splitting some wood and cleaning up the cabin a bit, small tasks to keep myself occupied. As the sky darkened again, I locked the door from the inside and settled near the stove. That night, I heard it again, the same sound. Snow crunching, faint and careful. This time it came from behind the cabin, near the woodshed. I held my breath, counting each sound. One step, then a pause. Another step. It stopped again, long enough for me to start doubting myself, and then I heard the soft scrape of something brushing against the wall. I stayed completely still, staring toward the door, my rifle within reach. I didn't move for at least an hour. The sound never came back, and eventually exhaustion won. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. More footprints, fresh ones. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows. I followed them a few yards into the trees before they vanished among the underbrush. My chest felt tight, but I told myself it had to be someone passing through. A hunter, maybe lost or curious. Still, I didn't like it. That day, I didn't wander far. I stayed close, keeping the rifle nearby even while chopping wood. The forest that had felt peaceful before now felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something. That evening, clouds rolled in, thick and low. Snow began to fall after sunset, tapping lightly against the roof. I sat near the stove, trying to read from an old magazine I'd found, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. The light from the fire reflected off the glass, making it hard to see outside. I felt tense, alert to every little sound. The wind picked up around midnight, whistling through cracks in the logs. I finally fell asleep sometime after 1. When I woke, it was still dark. I didn't know what time it was. My watch had stopped working the day before, but I knew something was wrong the second I opened my eyes. The door was slightly open, just a few inches, but enough for the cold to creep in. I hadn't heard it move. My stomach dropped as I sat up, my pulse hammering in my chest. The fire had burned down to coals, throwing faint orange light across the floor. I grabbed the rifle and moved slowly toward the door, stepping as quietly as I could. Outside, there were fresh footprints again, this time leading away into the trees. I followed them only a short distance before realizing they weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and there were no return tracks. Whoever had been there had come during the night and left before dawn. I stood in the freezing air for a while, staring into the black woods, until I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I went back inside and bolted the door. I didn't hunt that day. I barely ate. I just sat there, listening, waiting, jumping at every sound. Around noon, I thought I saw something move out past the tree-line. Just a shape, too far to make out clearly. It was gone when I looked again. By nightfall, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, keeping the rifle close, and waited for the first sign of daylight. When morning came, I loaded the truck and didn't look back. The forest was dead quiet again, the snow thick on the ground. About a mile down the road, I stopped because I saw tire marks that hadn't been there before. They turned off into the trees toward a small clearing. Curiosity made me look. The tracks ended at an old, rusted camper with one window shattered and the door hanging open. I didn't go near it. I just stared for a minute before getting back into the truck. I drove the rest of the way without stopping. It wasn't until I got home that the weight of it all really hit me. Whoever had been out there, whoever had circled that cabin, stood outside those windows, they had known I was alone. Maybe they'd been watching for days. Maybe that wasn't the first night they'd opened the door. I still go hunting sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep in the woods. I don't talk about it much, but every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that slow crunch of snow moving closer in the dark. It was late autumn of 2014, and I remember that week more clearly than anything else in my life. I was 27 then, tired of the city, tired of noise, people, and everything that kept pulling me in circles. I had saved just enough money to get away for a while, so I drove out to a remote part of northern Washington, somewhere near the foothills where dense pines covered everything like a thick, green wall. My plan was simple: to build a small cabin for myself on a patch of land I'd rented for the season, live quietly, and see what I was capable of doing alone. I didn't expect comfort, just peace. It was already raining when I arrived. the kind of slow, steady drizzle that soaks into your clothes and never seems to stop. The road leading to the clearing was mostly mud by the time I got there. The sound of rain hitting the car roof felt heavier than usual, echoing through the emptiness around me. I stepped out and sank slightly into the ground. There was no sound except for water hitting leaves, the faint rush of wind through the trees, and the occasional cracking branch from somewhere unseen. I had brought enough lumber, tools, and supplies to build a simple one-room cabin. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep me dry and warm. I unloaded everything under a tarp I'd stretched between two trees and got to work as soon as the rain lightened a bit. The air smelled of wet pine and dirt. Every few minutes I'd stop, just listening, trying to adjust to the silence that didn't feel like silence at all. It had this strange, pressing weight to it. By the second day, I had the foundation done. The mud was thick, and every step felt like dragging my feet through glue. My hands were cracked from the cold water and the rough wood. The rain came and went, never stopping for more than an hour at a time. I barely slept, just worked with a small lantern when it got too dark. At night, I'd stay in my truck with the seat reclined, listening to the rain and the faint sound of trees creaking. There were no lights anywhere, not even distant ones. On the fourth night, the weather turned worse. The rain wasn't just falling, it was pounding. I remember the way it sounded on the metal roof of my truck, like 1,000 nails hitting at once. I could barely see outside the windshield. The forest around me was pitch black, except when lightning flashed and briefly lit up the outlines of trees swaying under the wind. I should have stayed in the truck, but I was worried about the wood and tools getting soaked. When I stepped out, the cold hit me so hard I could barely breathe for a moment. My flashlight beam cut through sheets of rain, but the fog made everything look closer than it was. The tarp had come loose on one side, snapping violently in the wind. I went to tie it back down, my fingers numb and stiff. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud near the tarp. Deep ones, spaced unevenly, like someone had been walking there recently. They weren't mine, the boot size looked larger, heavier. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were from a hunter passing through earlier, or maybe some hiker, though it was too deep in and too wet for that. But the thing that got me was that they led from the trees straight toward my tarp, and then just stopped. There were no returning prints. I told myself it was probably just the rain washing them away. But still, something about them felt wrong. I tied down the tarp again, keeping my light on the edge of the tree line as much as I could, and then went back to my truck. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt closer than before. Twigs snapping, water dripping, branches scraping against each other. By morning, the ground was nearly flooded, but the rain had slowed to a drizzle again. I decided to finish the walls that day and get a roof up by evening. I didn't want to spend another night in the truck. Every nail I hammered echoed across the woods, and each echo sounded slightly delayed, almost like someone was hammering just a little after me, somewhere further off. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. It was late afternoon when I finally got the roof in place. My arms ached, and my clothes were soaked through. I moved my supplies inside and spread out a sleeping bag in one corner. The cabin was rough, just a wooden box with a door and a single small window, but it felt better than sleeping in the truck. I cooked a small meal on a portable stove and sat against the wall, watching steam rise from my wet boots. The rain picked up again around midnight, heavier than before. The wind howled through the cracks between the boards, and the whole structure creaked every time a gust hit it. Then came the noise. At first, it sounded like something brushing against the outer wall. Slow, dragging. I froze, listening. Then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone lightly running their hand along the wood. The sound circled around the cabin, pausing at the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned off the lantern and sat in complete darkness. For a while, there was nothing but rain. Then the sound came again, a dull, heavy thud against the door, like a shoulder bumping it gently. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear curious about the smell of food. But the steps I heard afterward were slow and heavy, deliberate. They stopped right under the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was within reach, but I was too afraid to turn it on. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer, and the sound finally stopped. I sat there until dawn, my eyes wide open, staring at the faint outline of the window against the gray sky. When light finally came through, I went outside, every movement stiff. There were prints again, much clearer this time. Large boot marks, same as before, circling the cabin, stopping at the door and the window. They were deep, fresh, and pointed away toward the trees. I followed them for a bit, just to see where they went. They led straight into the woods, down the hill, and then disappeared near the stream. I never saw any sign of whoever it was. That day I worked quietly, not even using the hammer much. I didn't like the sound it made anymore. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw something between the trees. Maybe just movement, maybe just the wind, but it always vanished when I tried to focus on it. By the sixth night, I couldn't take it anymore. The cabin felt smaller by the hour. Every noise outside sounded too close, too intentional. I packed my tools and what supplies I could fit back into the truck. The rain was coming down hard again, and the road had nearly turned into a river of mud. I didn't even look back at the cabin. When I got to the nearest small town that morning, I stopped at a diner for coffee. My clothes were soaked, my hands shaking. The waitress looked at me like I'd come back from a week in the woods, which I had, and said something about the weather being bad for building this time of year. I just nodded. I never went back to that place. I heard later that some hunters had found pieces of a broken tarp and a few boards scattered near the clearing months after. The cabin must have collapsed in the storm, or maybe someone had taken it apart. I didn't want to know. Sometimes, though, especially on nights when it rains like it did that week, I think about those footprints, how deep they were, how they stopped right at the window. I built that cabin to find peace, to prove I could live alone in silence. But what I found out, there was something else. Not ghosts, not monsters, just the simple, cold reminder that being alone in a place that far from everything isn't peaceful. It's exposure. It's vulnerability. It's the realization that when something moves out there, and you have no idea what it is, you're the intruder, not it. It was early October when I drove out to my late grandmother's old cabin in northern Minnesota. The trees were starting to turn red and orange, and the air had that heavy, quiet chill that only comes right before the real cold sets in. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a teenager, but I'd inherited the place after she passed away the year before. I'd been putting off going back, but I finally ran out of excuses. The cabin needed to be cleaned up, her things sorted, maybe sold off. It was a full day's drive from where I lived, deep in the woods near a dried-up lake that nobody visited anymore. I arrived around evening, just as the light was fading. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was narrow and uneven, and my tires kept slipping on loose gravel. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had peeled off most of the siding, and the porch sagged in the middle. The front steps creaked under my boots. There was an old smell in the air, a mix of wet wood, pine needles, and that faint sour scent that comes from things left untouched too long. I brought my dog, a brown shepherd mix named Rex. He stayed close to me the moment we stepped out of the truck. His ears were up, and he kept sniffing the air like he was trying to catch something I couldn't. Inside, the cabin looked almost the same as when I was a kid. The old furniture still sat where it always had. The big chair by the window, the square table with one leg shorter than the others, the iron stove in the corner that took forever to heat up. My grandmother's things were still scattered around. Her knitting basket by the rocking chair, the faded rug that smelled faintly like smoke, even the jar of buttons on the kitchen counter. I set down my bag and turned on the old oil lamp. The bulb overhead hadn't worked in years. The silence was thick, broken only by the creak of the floorboards when I walked and the slow ticking of the wall clock that hadn't been wound since she died. Rex paced around the living room, sniffing under the couch, then stood by the door leading to the small hallway. His tail was stiff. There were 2 bedrooms, hers and the one I used when I was younger. I planned to sleep in mine, but first I wanted to check her room. The door was half open. When I pushed it, the hinges made a sound that echoed through the whole cabin. Everything inside was coated in a thin layer of dust. Her bed was neatly made, though the sheets had gone yellow at the edges. The window was shut tight, but I could still smell that same heavy, musty scent that came from old things locked away too long. There were boxes stacked in one corner, some open, some taped shut. I started going through them, finding mostly clothes, letters, and old photographs. Most of the pictures were black and white. People I didn't recognize, old family faces, some with my grandmother standing stiffly beside them. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed something strange. I had slept badly. The cabin stayed cold all night, even though I lit the stove. At some point, I woke up because Rex was growling softly. His ears were perked, his body tense. I listened, but all I heard was the faint sound of wind outside and the ticking clock again. After a while, he settled down and I fell back asleep. In the morning, while making coffee on the stove, I noticed the trapdoor in the hallway. I'd forgotten it even existed. It led to the small cellar underneath the cabin where Grandma used to keep canned food and old tools. The handle was rusty, and the wood around it was darkened like it had soaked up moisture for years. I thought about checking it right then, but the air that seeped up through the crack was so cold and stale that I decided to wait until later. I spent most of that day cleaning and sorting through boxes. Every once in a while, Rex would go stand near the hallway again, nose pointed toward the trapdoor, his tail low. When I tried calling him away, he'd come, but reluctantly. By evening, I finally decided to open it. I pulled the trapdoor up, and a thick draft of cold air rolled out, bringing with it a smell that made my stomach tighten. Something metallic and sour, mixed with rot. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and shined my flashlight down the steps. The light barely cut through the dark, but I could see the outline of shelves, a workbench, and the corner of an old freezer that I didn't remember being there before. Rex stayed at the top, whining quietly. I climbed down the wooden steps. The boards groaned under my weight. The smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. I thought maybe a raccoon or some animal had gotten trapped down there and died. I walked over to the freezer. It was unplugged, the cord coiled on the ground beside it. The lid was closed, but the edges were darkened and sticky. My flashlight beam caught something on the floor, a dark stain that trailed from the corner of the freezer to the drain near the back wall. I felt my chest tighten. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. I hesitated for a long moment, then lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a moldy quilt, was something unmistakably human. A hand, stiff and grayish, stuck out from under the fabric. The fingernails were long and cracked. The skin looked leathery, like it had been dried out and preserved by the cold. My whole body froze. I slammed the lid shut and stumbled backward, hitting the shelf behind me. A jar fell and shattered on the floor. The smell got worse. I rushed up the stairs, nearly tripping over the last step, and pushed the trapdoor shut. I stood there for a long minute, breathing hard, staring at the wood like I expected it to open again. Rex was pacing, whining louder now. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to get out and call the police, but the cabin was too far from town. My phone barely had a signal out there. After a while, I forced myself to sit down and think. The freezer looked old, and the body, if that's what it really was, didn't seem recent. My grandmother had lived here alone for decades. She never let anyone go down there. I started remembering small things. Times when I was a kid and asked her about the cellar, how she'd always tell me to stay out of it. How sometimes, late at night, I thought I'd heard her down there moving around. I wanted to believe maybe it was something else, a mannequin, old medical supplies, anything. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. That night, I didn't sleep. Every small noise made me jump. The wind against the walls, the faint creak of the roof. I kept thinking about that hand, the way the skin looked, the way the smell stuck in my nose even after I'd left the cellar. At dawn, I packed my bag, grabbed Rex's leash, and went outside. The air was freezing, but it felt cleaner than inside the cabin. I drove until I got enough signal to call the sheriff's office. I told them everything, down to the smell, the freezer, and what I saw inside. It took them 3 hours to get there. I waited in my truck the whole time, staring at the cabin through the windshield. When they finally arrived, I followed them back inside. They opened the trapdoor, went down, and after a few minutes, one of them came back up. His face was pale. They taped the area off and called for more people. Later, one of the deputies told me they found an old male body, wrapped in blankets, likely decades old. There were no recent signs of violence in the cabin. From what they could tell, the body had been there for at least 20 years, maybe more. I learned a few weeks later that the man's identity was never confirmed. The sheriff said it could have been a drifter, maybe someone who worked nearby, maybe even a relative nobody knew about. My grandmother had never told anyone about him, and there were no records. I sold the cabin after that. I didn't go back to pack anything. I just signed the papers and let it go. But sometimes, when I think about her sitting in that rocking chair all those years, I can't stop wondering how she lived her last decades with that freezer under her floor. I wonder if she ever looked down there and felt guilty, or if she simply learned to live with it. Either way, I'll never go near that place again. It was the summer of 2012 when I drove out to a small cabin in northern Montana. I had rented it for a month just to get away from everything. No phone service, no neighbors, nothing but trees, dirt roads, and the sound of wind moving through tall pines. I was 33 then, working a job that had burned me out completely, and I thought isolation would somehow fix the exhaustion that had built up in me over the years. I brought my dog, a brown Labrador named Max, because I didn't want to be totally alone. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, down a gravel road that looked barely used, with tire tracks that disappeared under weeds. When I first arrived, the cabin looked like something out of an old hunting magazine. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows small, the porch slightly tilted forward. There was a shed out back that leaned so much I thought the first heavy wind would knock it down. I didn't mind though. I had brought enough food, water, and supplies for the month. There was a small generator for electricity and a hand pump for water beside the porch. It wasn't luxury, but that was the point. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up early, made coffee on the small gas stove, and took Max for long walks through the trees. The air smelled clean, sharper somehow than anywhere else I'd been. The silence was strange at first, the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. At night, I'd sit outside on the porch, listening to the faint hum of insects and the occasional owl call. The sky was so dark that the stars looked close enough to touch. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. It was on the 5th night when things started to feel off. I had gone to bed early, around 10. The air had turned colder that evening, and I had to pile an extra blanket on top of my sleeping bag. Around midnight, Max started growling low. I woke up immediately. He was sitting at the end of the bed, staring toward the front door. His body was stiff, ears pointed, tail down. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room, then aimed it at the door. Nothing, just the wooden boards and the weak light from the window. I listened hard and thought I heard something faint outside, like footsteps crunching in the dirt. Slow, careful ones. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe even a raccoon sniffing around. The cabin wasn't fully sealed, and the smell of food could easily attract something. I lay back down, but Max didn't. He stayed alert for almost an hour before finally curling up again. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time the wind moved, I tensed. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground around the porch was soft from rain the day before. There were prints in the dirt. Some were definitely from Max, but a few were boot prints. Human ones. They weren't mine. They led from the trees to the edge of the porch, then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. They looked fresh, maybe from the night before. My stomach twisted. I had no reason to think anyone would be out there, and no reason for someone to come near my cabin. I spent the rest of that day uneasy. I walked around the area, checking if maybe a hiker had passed through, but there was no sign of anyone. The road was empty. Around noon, I went down to the small stream about half a mile away to wash some dishes. When I came back, one of the chairs on the porch was turned slightly, like someone had sat there. I couldn't be sure, but I was almost positive I had left it straight earlier that morning. That night, I kept the light on, even though I hated wasting the generator's fuel. I sat in bed with Max beside me, his head resting on my leg. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again, this time clearer. Not footsteps, more like someone dragging something along the ground. The sound moved slowly past the side of the cabin. Then it stopped. I could hear the sound of breathing. Not heavy, but steady. Human. I didn't move. I just held my breath and waited. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound faded away. When daylight came, I checked again. There was something lying near the edge of the clearing, a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket, dirty, dark-colored. The boot prints were there again, this time circling behind the cabin. I noticed one more thing too. The small lock on the shed door was broken. The metal latch was snapped like someone had forced it open. Inside the shed were a few tools, an axe, a shovel, some rusted cans. The axe was gone. My mouth went dry when I realized that. I backed out slowly and went inside, bolting the main door. The next 2 nights were the longest of my life. I barely slept. Every sound felt like a warning. Max stayed restless too, pacing near the windows. By the 3rd night, I made up my mind to leave in the morning. I started packing my things late, just in case I had to rush. Around midnight, the generator shut off, the fuel had run out. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. I could hear rain starting to fall on the roof. Then, just as I sat down, something hit the back wall. A single thud, then another closer to the window. My heart hammered. I grabbed the flashlight, but when I aimed it toward the sound, the beam caught nothing. Then I heard the door handle move. Just a small click of metal. Someone was testing it. I held my breath. The handle stopped moving, but the footsteps didn't. They moved slowly along the side of the cabin again, circling it. The floor creaked under me as I backed up. I could hear Max growling low in his throat, teeth showing. The footsteps stopped at the back. Then silence. Minutes passed. I don't know how long. Then came a different sound, the soft crack of a branch outside the bedroom window. I didn't look. I just sat there until the first hint of dawn came through the cracks in the wood. When the light was strong enough, I finally looked outside. There were prints everywhere, muddy, uneven, circling the whole cabin. I found the axe buried in the ground about 10 feet from the porch, blade down. Whoever had been there had left it like that. I didn't wait to find out why. I packed what I could, loaded Max into the truck, and drove down that road faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. At a small diner in town, I asked the old man behind the counter if anyone lived near the cabin. He said the closest property was nearly 6 miles away and that years ago a hermit had lived somewhere in those woods, but no one had seen him in a long time. He shrugged like it wasn't anything unusual. I never went back. I left some of my things behind, tools, clothes, a sleeping bag, but I didn't care. For weeks after I returned home, I kept thinking about that broken shed door, the boot prints, the breathing in the dark. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty. But I know this, whoever it was had been watching me. The prints weren't random. They had circled the cabin again and again. Sometimes I still think about that piece of jacket on the branch and the axe stuck in the dirt, left standing like a message. I can still feel that night, the rain on the roof, the silence between the footsteps, the weight of not knowing who was out there. That cabin's probably still there, rotting deeper into the trees, and maybe someone else has rented it since then. I don't think they'd find anything unusual inside, but if they walk out back, they might still see that faint, sunken mark in the ground where the axe once stood. And if they stay long enough, maybe they'll hear what I did. The quiet, slow steps moving through the woods just before midnight. But I'll never know, because I won't ever go back. It was late October 2011 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin I had rented deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I was 34 at the time, going through a rough stretch after quitting a job I'd had for almost a decade. I needed space to think and to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from city noise and constant phone calls. I found the listing online, a weathered wooden cabin tucked against a slope near a frozen stream, surrounded by pine trees so dense they almost looked black from a distance. The pictures showed a calm, isolated spot with a small porch and a dirt road that wound down into the valley. I thought it would be peaceful. Took me almost 7 hours to reach the place. The last stretch of the drive was rough. Narrow dirt roads with no guardrails and fallen branches scattered across the path. The air got colder the higher I went, and the road seemed to disappear into a tunnel of trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already slipping behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped sharply. The cabin looked older than the photos. The paint had peeled off in strips, and the wood had turned gray from years of rain and snow. The front steps sagged slightly, and one of the windows had a thin crack running diagonally through the glass. But it was quiet, completely still, except for the wind brushing through the trees. That stillness was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the place smelled of dry wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old nails or rust. The floorboards creaked with every step, and a thin layer of dust coated most of the furniture. There was a small wood stove near the corner, a single bed with a worn mattress, a wooden table, and 2 chairs. The walls were bare except for a few nails and a single photograph tacked near the door, an old black and white image of the same cabin, maybe from decades ago, with 2 men standing beside it. They both had blank faces and wore thick jackets, their boots half buried in snow. I unpacked a few things, mostly canned food, a flashlight, and some tools. I had brought my dog, Rocco, a big brown mixed breed who usually barked at everything. But even he seemed strangely quiet that evening. He walked around the cabin slowly, sniffing the corners, and then lay down near the stove once I got a fire going. That first night was calm. The wind picked up a little, and I could hear branches scraping against the roof. I didn't sleep well, though. I kept waking up to faint sounds outside, like someone walking slowly in the snow. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal passing through, but it didn't sound like hooves. It sounded more like footsteps, slow, steady, and heavy. Each time I sat up to listen, it stopped. When I looked out the window, There was nothing, just trees and the dim white of the frozen ground under the moonlight. The next morning, I went outside to check around. The ground was half frozen, and thin patches of snow were scattered near the trees. I saw a few prints leading from the edge of the woods toward the cabin, stopping near the porch steps. They were too large and wide to be from a deer or any animal I recognized. The shape was more like a boot print, though uneven, as if whoever or whatever had been walking was limping or dragging one foot. The prints stopped right at the base of the stairs, and there were no prints leading away. I stood there for a long minute trying to make sense of it, and then brushed it off. Maybe it had snowed lightly and covered the rest of the tracks. I didn't want to think too much about it. That day I cut some wood and hiked a bit near the stream, but I never went too far. The woods there were thick and quiet in a strange way. I didn't hear any birds or rustling, just wind and the occasional crack of a branch. Even Rocco seemed on edge. His ears stayed perked, and he kept looking toward the trees as if he sensed something I couldn't see. By the third day, I was ready to head back down. The silence had started to feel heavy, and I couldn't shake the uneasiness that hung around the place. The air felt colder than it should have been for October, and that night, I had trouble sleeping again. Around midnight, I heard the same slow steps outside. They were closer this time, circling the cabin. The boards on the porch creaked softly, and Rocco lifted his head, growling low. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it through the window, but the beam caught nothing but a blur of trees. When I stepped outside, the sound had stopped. The air was freezing, and the forest felt heavier than ever. I stood there for a long time listening and then went back in. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. Near the back of the cabin, close to where the stream cut through the trees, there was a pile of stones, freshly moved, the dirt still damp and dark. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal den, but when I brushed the stones aside, I found a torn piece of fabric buried beneath them. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, thick and faded green, with what seemed to be dried blood near the edge. Covered it back up, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away, and I didn't have any cell service up there. I told myself I'd leave the next morning, first thing. I packed what I could that night, barely eating, keeping the flashlight on the entire time. Every sound outside made my chest tighten. The wind, the creak of the roof, the snap of a branch. Around 3 a.m., Rocco started barking. Not his usual playful bark, but the deep, frantic one I had only heard when he was truly scared. I grabbed the flashlight and saw movement outside the window. A shadow, tall and broad, crossing near the tree-line. Stopped for a moment, just standing there. I couldn't make out a face or any details, only that it was human-shaped and not moving. I turned off the light and waited. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. After what felt like hours, the shadow disappeared into the trees, and the forest went silent again. When morning came, I didn't waste time. I threw the rest of my stuff in the truck, called for Rocco, and started the engine. The road down was narrow and rough, and I drove faster than I should have. About a mile down the hill, I saw something that made me stop cold. There was an old rusted truck parked halfway off the dirt road, its front half buried in weeds. The windows were gone, and the door hung open. Inside, there was a coat lying across the seat, the same green color as the torn fabric I'd found behind the cabin. I didn't check any further. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the small gas station near the bottom of the mountain. When I got out, I realized my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the keys. I told the man at the counter that someone should check the road up there, that there might have been an accident or something worse. He nodded slowly, like he'd heard it before. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I read in a small local paper about a missing man who had been working in the logging areas near those woods. They found his truck, but not him. The description matched what I'd seen, the same jacket, the same area. It's been years since then, but sometimes I still dream of that place. The sound of footsteps in the snow, the weight of silence pressing down on the cabin, the way the trees looked at night, almost like they were leaning in closer each time I blinked. I've camped since then, but never alone, and never that deep in the woods. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I never have, but something was out there that night, something real, alive, and too close, and I'll never forget the way it felt. Like I wasn't supposed to be there, like the mountain itself was trying to tell me to leave before I became just another name on a missing poster.